Alright, welcome everybody to Life Science Live. I'm back in the elevator among the trees again because spring is in the air and this feels right with the birds and the leaves. It's not quite this leafy outside yet, but it's warming up, and if you're paying really close attention, you might start to notice some little leaves popping up on the plants and new plants starting to grow out of the dirt. It's one of my favorite times of year when we start seeing the signs of spring. And people will say that spring is in the air, and that is definitely really literal, especially if you have allergies. A lot of people are probably starting to notice that they're starting to get all stuffed up and coughing and sneezing, and a lot of people hate this time of year because of that. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about those plants that are causing your allergies. And everybody knows that pollen is important, and pollen is the biggest thing causing those allergies, which you're probably aware. But you've learned since you were in elementary school that we need pollen, because without pollen we don't have flowers, and without flowers we don't have fruit, and without fruit we don't have plants, and without plants we don't have a lot of food. The world just wouldn't work without plants. And the way that plants grow starts with pollen, even before the seeds. So pollen is super important, and that's why we're going to talk about it. So to start off, a lot of people might not realize what pollen looks like up super close. So let's get our little picture here. There we go. Oh, that's it's taking a second to load the right picture. Here we go. Okay, so this right here is like a scan. I always forget what these are called. It's a colorized image, really, really close up, microscopic. Scanned electron, I think. Ooh, speaker issues with the sounds. Hopefully you can still hear me okay. Hopefully that stops in a second. Yeah, so here's some pollen. I might step out of the elevator if that keeps going. There we go. Alright, sorry about that. So, really close-up pictures of some pollen, and these are from all different kinds of species, so you can see the different shapes that they have on the surface, different textures that might help them to just decide that it's wanting to load. All kinds of technical difficulties this morning. There we go. Alright, so you have all different kinds of shapes and textures and ways that the pollen is getting around. So, once the pollen makes it to the plant that it wants to go to, and we'll talk about how it gets there for most of the rest of this Life Science Life, but here's another microscopic image of pollen. And so the pollen's whole goal is to make it to the female part of the flower. So the male part of the flower is where the pollen comes from. And so it has one of the reproductive cells in it, and then the female reproductive cells are in the female part of the flower. And so pollen's made up of those. There's a few vegetative cells, ones that can just grow on their own, that don't need another gamete. They don't need other reproductive cells to grow. And so those vegetative cells, once the pollen lands on the top of the female flower, it makes this little tube that grows down into the female flower, and then it releases the reproductive cells from the pollen, which meets the female reproductive cells in the flower, and then it starts to make a seed. So that's when the fruit would start to develop, and then inside the fruit you'd have a seed. But it all starts with the pollen. So how does the plant know when to start making the pollen? Because if the plant tried to send off its pollen like in the middle of winter, it would probably either die, it wouldn't have any flowers to go to, and so we have to think first about why the plants are even making their pollen in the spring and how they know that it's time. And it's really complicated actually, and super fascinating, and absolutely a miracle of nature. But plants use a combination of different factors to decide when it's time to start. When it's time to start making pollen, and when it's time to start growing leaves, and when it's time to start flowering. The biggest ones are light, and which is related to the length of the day, and then temperature. So For light, it's interesting because the plants are actually measuring the darkness period. So once the nights start to get shorter, then they know that the days are longer, and so they'll start to flower. And there's a lot of, they're called photoreceptors inside the plant that can sense. They don't have eyes to see when the sun comes up and when it gets dark, but they have these special photoreceptors that use just a chain of chemical reactions to tell the plant, okay, now you can start growing and you can start making flowers. And they do that just based on the length of the day. But they don't exclusively go off the length of the day, because sometimes, like, we'll have these weird cold snaps and hot snaps, and the temperature is really important to the flowers, to the plants too. And so if they just went off the day length, every year could be a little bit different and they might not grow as well. So there are other receptors in the plants that can sense when it's getting warmer and when it's getting colder. Some plants rely on that to know when to start growing from the seed. So like you might have flowers that just grow and die in 1 year. And so those seeds, they rely on a cold period where the seed has to get really cold, and then the seed has to get hot, and then it'll germinate. So a lot of seeds, if they don't get cold and then warm, they just won't grow. So if it's warm all the time, it might not grow, which is why it's important for us to have a winter and then a spring in order for the seeds to grow in the first place. And it's kind of the same way with when the flowers start to grow. They are looking for the cycles of cold and hot. And sometimes the temperature might trick the plant. It might, like just this past week, we had those few days where it was really warm and now it's pretty cold. Yesterday it snowed. So that's why they rely on both the temperature and the day length. So once they get the right combination, then they'll start to grow. And it's different for every species. So some plants, depending on what kind of plant it is and where it's growing and even what other plants are around. Oh, it's doing it again. All right, sorry to all of you guys that are watching. We are migrating because there were some weird noises in the elevator and then my service went out. So we're gonna go head upstairs and sit in front of some plants up there. Let's see, while I'm walking, so we were talking about, where were we? Oh yeah, so the different timing of the plants. So we have all different plants that they don't want to all grow at the same time because some wolf noises, super fun. Let's just sit kind of by the lines, why not? I was looking for some plants, but there aren't as many plants up here as I was picturing. Ooh, or the bear. These guys have some trees. All right. Real quick readjustment here. Okay, so the timing. So yeah, if all the plants were to pollinate at the same time, there'd be a lot of competition. And the problem with that is that the more competition there is, the less likely that your seeds are going to survive. And the whole point of all of this is to have seeds that can grow into new flowers the next year. So they look at the day length, the temperature, and then the other plants that are around. They actually have receptors that can sense the light reflecting off of their neighbors. And if there's a lot of plants around, they'll grow faster, they'll flower earlier, they'll put out their pollen faster, and they'll try to beat those other flowers to it. So there's a lot of complicated interactions going on that help the flowers decide when to grow. Walking up the stairs made me out of breath, so we're gonna readjust here while I catch my breath. If you have questions for anybody who's watching, you're welcome to stick them in the chat, or if you have any comments on anything at all. All right, so plants, we know how they decide when to make their pollen. We know what they want to do with their pollen. They want to get their pollen out there, reproduce, make new trees, new flowers. But for the rest of the time, we're going to talk about how that pollen gets around. So there are several methods for pollen dispersal because plants can't move. They can't walk around and find a tree or something like that like animals can. So they've got to rely on other mechanisms to get their pollen out there. And one of the most familiar, one of the ones that we talk about the most, I feel like, is pollinators, which is super cool. So there we have lots of different animals that plants rely on in order to get their pollen around. We have insects and bats, not so much in Utah. Most of our, or all of our bats here are insect-eating bats. But we do have a lot of insects and birds that plants rely on to get their pollen around. Usually, plants that rely on pollinators have pretty flashy flowers. They'll be bigger, they'll be noticeable, and they want to get those animals' attention. A lot of times they'll make nectar. Nectar is really only for animals. Like, a plant doesn't need the nectar except to attract pollinators to get its seeds around, or to get its pollen around, which is kind of interesting to think about. Like, the plants just over time evolved nectar because of animals, not because of the plants needing to eat nectar. Sometimes the flowers will have like really specific shapes based on what kind of pollinator they want to attract. So if they're making nectar, they don't just want anybody to get that nectar, so they'll have like a really specific flower shape or a really specific color to attract the right kind of animal. And so we can see a few different kinds of flowers in Utah that want pollinators. This one right here is one of my favorite flowers of all time. It's called curly cup gumweed, which is the cutest name. And you can see where it gets its name from, these little curly cups right there. And those are really sticky and smelly. And that smell attracts a lot of insects. So the ones that curly cup gumweed's trying to attract are mostly bees and wasps and butterflies. And so if you ever see curly cup gumweed, especially now that it's spring, start to look for those pollinators that are hanging out around it. And one cool thing about flowers, with insects in particular, so we can't see all of the light spectrum, but insects, they can see ultraviolet light. And so we might even see like these brightly colored flowers, and they're pretty cool and attractive looking. But to insects, they're even more so. So this right here is a dandelion, and that's what a dandelion flower might look like to a bee. In the ultraviolet spectrum, they can see like this highlight around where the pollen is, so that the flower is calling the bee right to the middle of the flower so that they get right to that pollen. The bee goes for the nectar, and then they carry the pollen around to another flower. Another really cool pollinator that we have in Utah is hummingbirds. So this here is called firecracker penstemon, which is a really fun name. And the flowers of penstemon are shaped just right for the hummingbird's little beak and tongue to go down into the base of the flower to get the nectar. And as it does, its beak kind of brushes in that pollen, and then when it goes to another flower and sticks its beak in, it deposits the pollen in there and then picks up more pollen to bring to other flowers. And so as this pollen is getting spread around, it's spreading around the plant's genes, which makes for healthier plants, because the more diverse you are, the easier it is for you to resist disease and to adapt to new situations that you might have to grow in. And so that's really important. But not all plants rely on pollinators. One of the other really big methods for getting your pollen around, I shouldn't have locked that because now I'm gonna have to unlock it again. One of the other really big methods is wind. Wind pollination is huge in the plant world, and we don't talk about it as much because usually plants that use wind pollination just aren't as flashy. They're not trying to attract pollinators because all they're doing is just releasing their pollen out into the air, and then it just floats away on the wind and eventually makes it, hopefully, to another flower. And that is why pollen is an issue with allergies. So a lot of times, like, good rule of thumb, if you see a flower that's super flashy and pretty, you can assume that it's probably not causing your allergy issues. But if you see a flower that's like not super flashy, you might not even notice those flowers. Those are the ones that are using wind to pollinate, and they have to release a lot of pollen out into the air in order to make sure that their pollen makes it to another flower. Because if they just put out like a little bit, then there's not as much of a chance for it to get to another flower. So there's some cool trade-offs that you can think about, because the pollinator flowers, like the ones that need to use birds and bees and insects and bats and things like that, they have to make stuff to attract those animals. So they're putting a lot of energy into making nectar and putting energy into being colorful and having big flowers. They have to grow a little bit more just to get those animals to come. The wind pollinators, they have to make a lot of pollen, but they don't have to make as much flashy, attractive stuff. So depending on the type of plant and where they're growing and just their strategies for life, there are different ones that work better for different plants, different ways of doing things. So the wind pollinators, we have a bunch in Utah, and the really cool thing, so if you have issues with allergies, you can go to this website, the Intermountain Allergy and Asthma website, and they have a pollen count. So we're actually gonna look at it real quick. It's redirecting us. Let's see if it comes up. Almost there. There we go. So here's their website. This is the pollen count website. And if you scroll down, and if it'll let us see. So this was a couple days ago, and it shows you what the pollen counts were. So you can see the elm pollen was really high, the cottonwood pollen was really high, the cedar and juniper was really high, and then willow pollen was low. And mold is a different animal, different, I shouldn't say animal, a different creature altogether. So this is actually today, March 11th, and you can see what they've measured as the highest pollen. And so elm is really high right now. It actually, this one says medium, so maybe not as bad as a couple days ago, which is interesting. Cottonwood is low, juniper is low, and those are kind of some of the biggest things that are making pollen right now. So generally, in February to May, that's when the trees are pollinating. And I brought some of those flowers to give you an example of why the elm pollen is super high or higher, and the cottonwood pollen is not so high. So this is actually, I just picked this from campus like 30 minutes ago. This is from an American elm, which is a native tree to North America. And these are its flowers. So like we were saying, not super flashy. They're pretty small. They're not like terribly noticeable. When they're growing on the tree, let me actually get a picture up here. There you go. When they're growing up on the tree, they look kind of like this. And so you'll start to notice like just those little colorful buds all over the tree. And those are the elm flowers. And so what they do is they just put out their stamen. Try to get it to focus on him. They put out their pollen, and then it just floats into the wind. And these guys are just coming out, like right now. So that's why elm pollen is like medium to high in the air right now. And we had that snow and rain yesterday, which kind of washed out some of the pollen from the air. So that's probably why it was higher a few days ago than it was today. But elm is definitely one of the biggest things right now. Another one that we saw on there that's one of the biggest pollen producing trees here in Utah is cottonwood. And these couple of branches are from today that I pulled from some cottonwood. And you can see these are just little buds. So some of the cottonwood is starting to get the flowers on cottonwood look like this. You can call them catkins, which I think is fun. They look kind of like little cattails. And so those flowers will come out, the pollen will come out of all of these teeny little flowers and float in the air. But right now, they're just in buds, most of them. There are a few that have started to like release their catkins, but here on campus at least, they're not quite yet. But you can see this is the top that you can see on my bud. So the bud will crack open, the catkin will come out, and it'll start putting out pollen. And a lot of people, they'll see the cottonwood pollen later, or they'll see the cottonwood trees later in the year, and they look like this. They've got all that white cotton where their name comes from. But that's not actually what's causing your allergies. So a lot of people see the cottonwood fluff like floating around, and they get really concerned that that's what's causing their allergies. And it is annoying. It kind of looks messy when it gets all over the ground, but that's what the seeds are in. So their seed dispersal also works through wind. They have this cottony fluff around their seed that allows it to just float away, find somewhere else to grow, hopefully somewhere with less competition. But really what causes allergies with cottonwood is the pollen that comes from the flowers that would come out of these buds, probably here in a week or two, or maybe a little longer. Then the last tree that we saw on the list of trees that are causing the most pollen right now was juniper, which I think is a really cool one to talk about because it's not an angiosperm. It's not a flowering tree exactly like these guys. So what they make instead is cones. And if you look at this, it's not like pine cones like we see on pine trees. It's actually these little brown guys, just barely on the tips. Those aren't like dead leaves or anything. Those are actually pollen cones. So these are the male cones. And as it starts to make pollen, these little cones will just open up and just release some pollen into the wind. And once it makes contact with the female cone looks like this. Those are what we would often refer to as juniper berries. And so that's what will develop into a seed. These are the seed cones. So you've got the pollen cones, the tiny little brown guys, and the seed cones, the ones that look like berries. So juniper's super cool too. It's also causing allergies. But later in the year, when the cottonwood's gone to seed, there are things that are still causing your allergies. And the biggest thing from like May to July is grasses. And apparently one of the bad ones in Utah that causes a lot of allergies is Bermuda grass, which we sometimes use as lawn grass. And you can see this is the grass flower. So I don't actually have a picture of the whole grass. I should have gotten some. But the grass blades look just like normal grass blades. And then in like the late spring, early summer, it starts to make these little flower heads. And all of those little tiny guys are the anthers that produce the pollen. I've got a close-up picture of it. So these little guys will pop out, the pollen will come out, and then the pollen will just blow across the field of grass. And so it gets all in the air, makes us really stuffed up and our eyes and our noses itch. But it works well for the grass. They don't have to rely on pollinators, they just rely on the wind and the air to get their pollen around. And then late in the summer and even into the fall, we start to have a lot of weeds that will make a lot of pollen. One of the bad ones here in Utah is ragweed. So this is what ragweed flowers look like. I actually think they're really cute. They kind of hang upside down, but they make a lot of pollen. And if you ever down in like July and then all the way up until like the first frost at the end of the fall, they'll be producing pollen, and you can actually like tap the top of the ragweed flowers and you'll just get pollen on your hands. And so early in the spring, we've got the trees through like February through May, and that's what's happening right now. Then middle, like early summer through the middle of summer, you have the grasses, and that's what's making the pollen. And then at the end of summer and into the fall, a lot of those annual weeds will start to make pollen. So that was a lot of talk about pollen. I think it's really fascinating. Hopefully you guys learned some fun stuff. And if you have any questions, or if there was anything I didn't talk about that you want me to talk about, or if I said anything that seemed off and you would like some clarification or corrections, let me know. Hopefully you guys have a wonderful week. Hopefully your allergies aren't too bad. And I will talk to you soon. Bye.